just as a warning, since we have 3 speakers today, we will not have time for audience Q&A. But if you are having technical difficulties, please let us know, and we have folks on standby ready to help you. So I'm so excited to have Dr. Catherine Belling, Dr. Megan Crowley-Matoka, and medical student David Kendall Casey to share their perspectives on Frankenstein and bioethics and medicine. So they'll be coming up to do their introductions and state their positionality to Frankenstein. And then after that, we'll do a Q&A amongst ourselves. And yeah, I'm just so excited. I'll let them do their own introductions as they come up to do their presentations. So first up, we have Dr. Belling.
Hi, is this working okay? Yeah, good. I'm Catherine Belling. I am the literature person in the medical my stomach did that, sorry. The literature person in the medical humanities and bioethics MA program. We always read Frankenstein as part of the literature core course in the part where we go from literature and medicine to literature and bioethics, because it's the kind of perfect key text for connecting those two things. And I'll think a little bit about that with you today. But as well as that, I'm interested in Frankenstein because my I guess research focus, the work that I'm doing at the moment is about horror. Horror as in horror stories and horror movies, of course, but also as in horror as a feeling, as a reaction, a response, an emotion, an affect that is, and a physical response to things that has been, I think, very under-theorized and not thought about as much as it, or as precisely as it could have been, and both in general and in relation to medicine particularly. And so this Frankenstein fits pretty well there too. So what I want us to think about just really quickly is this obvious question, right? What does make Frankenstein a horror movie? And I love this poster, the original horror show, the 1931 film. And to think a little bit about what that might mean, especially for bioethics. So this is, I'll go through very fast. The word horror, obviously, you initially think horror movies. But more broadly, as a genre, it's something that's intended to elicit in the audience the reaction of horror. Comes from no, I did that again. It's not my stomach. The etymology is from horripilation, or it comes from the same source, which means, as in piloerection, when you're piloerection, where your hairs stand up on the back of your neck, the effect of goose flesh, right? The thing that makes your body shudder in response to certain stimuli. And so it's a physical response, but obviously it's also cognitive. It's a response to something that produces that. And you've got the sort of basic thing like a jump scare where you just startle and that affects your body, but also there's the slow recognition of something very terrible, which can produce a feeling of horror. And today we're talking about horror and a monster and the slow recognition. I will stop there, but we can think about that. One of the things about horror is it is not fear. And that often becomes, is confused in lots of ways. And I'll say even in people who work quite seriously on horror movies and then spend all their time talking about fear. And we think about scary movies, but fear is anticipatory. When you fear something, you fear that it might happen, which means that you follow that sentence. I am afraid that this will happen, but it might not. Horror is what happens when it has already happened and you behold it and there is nothing more to be done, at least not in the short term. So it's a different kind of response. I think of it as something that happens when it's too late. And two important parts of it is that it's the recognition, a shocking recognition of something that is extreme or abnormal, a form of harm, and that leads to cognitive disruption in the observer. So obviously examples would be like someone whose body is sewn together out of different body parts and should be dead but is alive. That complicates your schema. It's not congruent with your idea of how the world works. Seeing someone's insides on the outside, that's not how people are supposed to be. That is horrifying, and so on. And you can expand. I'm sure you can think of lots of examples. And so What I want to think about is where the horror is in Frankenstein. And there are two places. This sort of obvious way is we immediately think, well, a monster. A monster is the thing that almost by definition is schema incongruent, right? It's something that is monstrous, meaning it is not normal, it's abnormal, and therefore disturbing and therefore horrifying. And so obviously the monster in Frankenstein is the thing that is most commonly associated with the idea of Frankenstein as a horror movie. Later on, of course, we realize he's also a murderous monster and he is carrying out revenge, but that's almost secondary to the initial, okay, well, we'll actually go on to this one. Here's some different versions of the monster. And what's interesting, of course, is if you've read the novel, he's never directly described in ways that make him seem that he will look a lot like these, very scary, disturbing. See, I also go to scary stereotypes. And if you look at the picture right down in that corner, that's an engraving from the frontispiece of the original novel, and you can see he's a lot less strange and grotesque looking than in the story versions that have followed, the filmed versions. But so the most obvious response to the film as horror story is that it's about a monster. But I want just to, and here's the description, but I'll jump over it in the interests of time. Well, actually I won't. Victor looks at him and says, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature. And then what horrifies him, the creature looks at him and turns out to be alive. No mortal could support the horror of that countenance. So it's only when he comes to life and looks at his creator that he becomes monstrous. And so then the second horror in the film is the horror that we actually observe in Frankenstein, in Victor, where he says he feels horror. What is it that makes him feel horror? And in the 1931 film, it takes a while. At first, he's delighted, as you can see, shouting, "It's alive! I have succeeded! My science worked!" And yet, this image is from the Kenneth Branagh remake. A slightly more ambivalent facial response, I think. But what's important about the film, about the story, is the question of what it is that horrifies Victor Frankenstein. And it's not necessarily the same thing that horrifies us, just thinking about, a monster horrifies us. There's a real connection there, quite accidentally, I'm certain, between Charles Darwin's account of emotions based on facial expressions. But you can see that particular response of extremity. And I like the way it's associated with agony as well as horror. The extreme beholding of something which is actually breaking apart your cognitive schema of how the world should be. And what Victor says about this, how can I describe my emotions? I'd worked so hard. I desired it with an ardor that exceeded moderation. But now that I was finished, breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. And one of the things to think about there is the ethical implications of Victor's feeling of horror. And you could argue that in many ways, the monster does not become a monster until he looks at it and is horrified, as opposed to, we might imagine, impressed, proud of himself, willing now to care for the creature he created. And this line, I think, and this is from the screenplay of the Kenneth Branagh version, is really telling. The first thing he says once he realizes that it is alive, "What have I done?" And I think that moment of recognizing, I have done a terrible thing and it is done. What am I going to do now? And in this film version, he grabs a hammer and just smashes the creature's head with it. It does survive, spoiler. But at the moment, he thinks he's killed it. And then he writes in his notebook, and of course, there's another piece here we could think about a lot in terms of the reproductive subtext, massive birth defects. The result is malfunctional and vile. I have chosen to abort. He destroys the monster because he thinks he has produced a monstrous birth from what he did. What's interesting is that what horrifies him is his success. And what follows from that, the bad thing that he does, is not successfully endeavoring to do something and then succeeding in it. What horrifies us, or what leads to the ethical failure and the vengefulness of the monster, is his failure to follow through, his lack of responsibility for the outcomes of his research, the fact that he's horrified by what he has done and then tries to just destroy the work instead of recognizing that he now has a responsibility for it. And I think that's all I have at this point. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. And now we'll welcome up Thank you, everybody. I think Dr. Fallon different. Yep, that's fine.
Hi, everyone. I am Megan Crowley-Matoka. I am a medical anthropologist by training, so that's kind of how I will be coming at this. And I get to do the social science teaching in our medical humanities and bioethics curriculum, both in the general medical education and also with our master's students. And I'm also someone who has spent a bunch of my research is focused on organ transplantation in a variety of places. So Mexico, here in the US, and a little bit in Spain. So that's kind of the angle of entry I have here is just thinking about how Frankenstein shows up as a kind of ubiquitous figure in transplant medicine and what that might help us think about. So here's my first encounter with Frankenstein in the day-to-day clinical work of transplant. I'm doing fieldwork in Mexico some years ago, shadowing a transplant surgeon in his clinic where he's doing follow-up visits with people who've gotten a kidney transplant. And this very dapper, jovial gentleman enters, he's in his 50s. It's a very kind of routine follow-up visit. He had a transplant about 6 months ago from his sister, a kidney, and both he and his sister are doing quite well. This is very much a check some lab work, check some meds kind of visit. And during the process, the patient keeps joking, keeps kind of returning to this whole series of jokes that he's making with his surgeon about how he's still keeping an eye out for any sign of a feminine thing coming out in him. Or he tells a little story about, the guys at my card game last night were asking me, are you sure you're still really a real man now that you've got your sister's kidney in you? Are you sure you're not some kind of half woman? And the surgeon doesn't really engage any of these. He doesn't really respond. He kind of brushes them off. But then after the patient leaves, he turns to me, the surgeon, and he says this. He says, that one, he jokes, but really he is worried, a little obsessed even. He has this idea that getting his sister's kidney makes him half woman. We see it sometimes, this fear. Frankenstein syndrome, we call it, when the transplant patients can't stop thinking about where the organ came from, and that it's maybe made them into something kind of different. And I think the kind of insistent jocularity, but the return to that joke really was hinting at something that was very present for this patient. And it's striking, right? Suddenly Frankenstein pops up in the middle of this clinic visit in a transplant program in Mexico. But that phrase, Frankenstein syndrome, is one that is actually pretty commonplace in transplant medicine. It's one I came to encounter elsewhere, not just in Mexico, but other places as well. And it's really trying to capture something about a transplant sense of the way that having someone else's body part inside of them might change them in some really fundamental way, that it might change them some sense of their identity, of their self. And it's a label that doesn't just sort of describe that experience that transplant patients might have, but it really explicitly pathologizes it, right, as syndrome, as problem. And I came to learn as I continued in this work that not just this label of Frankenstein syndrome was common, but that experience itself of thinking about the possibilities for that one's identity might be changed in receiving a transplant was also, in fact, really quite common. In fact, not just in my own research, but we have this incredibly rich long-term range of social science research in transplant that starts from the very earliest days as transplant kind of moved from being an experimental science to being a clinical reality in the late 1950s, spans across the globe, not just my work in Mexico, but we have work from Japan, Egypt, India, Germany, many others besides. This is just a smattering. And social scientists really routinely report that this is a pretty shared phenomenon. It's common, it's not universal, but it's absolutely common for people involved in transplantation, recipients, but also living organ donors, donor families, and even transplant professionals to kind of fold possibilities for transformation beyond the merely biomechanical into their experiences of transplant. And really importantly, these experiences are not always kind of negative in the way they were for that gentleman in Mexico. They're not always a source of unease or horror. Sometimes they are, but sometimes patients really experience these possibilities in much more positive, expansive, maybe connective, even kind of magical or joyous ways. And so people shared with me stories about realizing that they'd taken on the hand gestures or the bubbly laughter or the curly hair of their sibling kidney donor, or described realizing that they had a particular delight in a very specific shade of blue or a sudden obsession with fried chicken that they came to identify and came to learn was characteristic of their deceased donor. Meanwhile, transplant clinicians, even as they pathologize their patients' imaginings along these lines, themselves sometimes pondered the kind of extra biological, combinatory, transformative potentials of transplant. In Mexico, I frequently heard transplant professionals share asides like, well, when the donor really loves the patient, it goes better. The kidney just wants to work. Or the anthropologist Margaret Locke had a North American transplant surgeon kind of confess to her a little bit sheepishly that he himself would absolutely never accept an organ from a murderer. And so running throughout the kind of day-to-day clinical imaginings, but also the embodied experience of transplant medicine are this set of deep connections with both the explicit name as a diagnostic label and of Frankenstein, and also some of Frankenstein's enduring questions about the promise and the perils of bringing self into other and life into death. And these date back right to the very earliest days of the field, the truly spectacular occasion of the first heart transplant, the first successful one, in 1967 in South Africa. These are some really famous images that circulated really widely. And both the patient, Louis Washkansky, and the surgeon, Christian Barnard, were widely reported as both describing themselves as Frankenstein. And I'm so intrigued by this kind of doubled self-identification with Frankenstein. I mean, is the patient calling himself a kind of monster here? Is he signaling a sense of strangeness and also asking for recognition of being still human, despite that, in a way that, for me, kind of echoes with the poignancy of the literary creature's suffering? Is the surgeon really claiming the mantle of this kind of ethically reckless scientist, mad with the desire to create? Is he acknowledging a sense of the fearsome risk of operating on the experimental edges of medicine? So all of that I find super interesting, that they would reach for this label for themselves, both of them. And I'm also really intrigued by the recurrent slippages, the intriguing ambiguity here between the way we think about Frankenstein as patient and surgeon, as creator and created. We use the same name for both, right? Pretty commonly. And there's a ton that we could dig into here, but where I want to end for now is just to draw our attention to the social fact of the ubiquity of the Frankenstein figure in transplant medicine, to the very ease and frequency with which it's reached for by patients, by doctors, by observers. And that is to say, to the way that Frankenstein operates as a kind of icon in transplant, a figure whose broad strokes are immediately recognizable, one that seems to so quickly condense and highlight a set of really useful, relevant ideas, values, anxieties. In terms that anthropologists like to use, we could say that Frankenstein has seemed enduringly good to think with in transplant medicine in all sorts of ways. But here's the thing about iconic figures like Frankenstein that we anthropologists also are always interested in, not just how powerfully do they represent and draw our attention to certain things, but also perhaps how do they distract us from others? So here's this immediately recognizable figure, right? Just these few lines summon up Frankenstein for us immediately. And notably, it's the figure of the monster, right? It's not this figure or this figure. It's not Victor Frankenstein. That is the one that calls that to mind. And it is true also that almost any sort of discussion of Frankenstein will have that little corrective moment of like, remember, Frankenstein wasn't the monster, he was a scientist. And yet this is the image that we bring to mind in just these few strokes. And just those few strokes, just the name Frankenstein can summon up all these rich associations and anxieties that get invoked in everyday clinical life in transplant medicine in some of the ways that I've been suggesting here. Ideas about the unstable relations between and boundaries between self and other, between life and death, between doctor and patient. But I want to leave us with a question about what this iconic image also perhaps obscures. What might it draw our attention away from or make harder to see? And I'll leave us with just one possibility for what thinking with Frankenstein and transplant maybe makes harder to see. And that's the question of organ donors. Because the Frankenstein figure and story is fundamentally about creator and created, and not about the people from whom the body parts came, right? Those figures are entirely absent from that iconic dyadic figure of Frankenstein echoed in those movie stills, in that famous photograph from the first heart transplant that I showed you. And all too often, those figures are perhaps largely absent in the stories we tell about transplant as well.
All right. And now we have Mr. Casey. Thank you.
All right. So yeah, just by way of reintroducing myself, I guess I'm David Casey, originally from Indianapolis, grew up partially in Rhode Island as well. Just some about my background. I got my undergrad degree in philosophy, and then a master's degree. So you can see how I got to medical school from there. A lot of people ask me about that origin story, but it's for another time. So, and then currently I'm also pursuing, so along with the MD, pursuing the MA in the Medical Humanities and Bioethics program. So really where I want to sort of position myself with regard to Frankenstein is talking about the concepts of the sublime and the grotesque. So these are two motifs that really run throughout the novel and come up, compared and contrasted and juxtaposed very often. And so I just want to spend this sort of introductory time laying out how I think about these concepts. Yeah, we'll kind of leverage them towards talking about Frankenstein in more of the answer section. But so we think about words like sublime as being supremely awesome or really beautiful. But concepts like the sublime and the grotesque are really interesting, I think, linguistic constructions. Sublime captures a very complex emotion that often can't be put into like a single sort of OED definition. And so as a philosophy major, I got to go with the philosophers here. So one of my favorites is Schopenhauer. And I'd just like to talk a little bit about how he sets out this conception of the sublime. And interestingly, I think it's kind of fascinating that he wrote his big treatise that kind of talks about a lot of this in the same year as Frankenstein, as Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. But basically, in a very truncated version, Schopenhauer talks about how there are really two aspects of aesthetic perception, right? Perceiving objects that one finds aesthetically pleasing. Of course, on the one side, there's the subjective, which is the will, or what can be defined as like general sort of egoistic strivings. And we'll just call it ego going forward to make it simple. And then there's the other side, which is the perceived object, right? So a person standing in front of a painting or a mountain or whatever. The person or within the person is kind of the ego, and the perceived object is represented in that person's consciousness. And then he says, there's really two aspects of aesthetic experience, right, that take place within the individual doing the contemplating. And one of those aspects is when one contemplates objects that are what he calls non-threatening to the ego, right, or are non-harmful. So this basically captures the idea of what we call beautiful. Where something could be really beautiful in the sense that the ego or the one's like general strivings and goals about their lives are sort of momentarily forgotten in contemplating a really beautiful object. So if you think about a really intricate, aesthetically pleasing flower, you can kind of just sit there and look at it and forget all about your, the things going on in your life. And Schopenhauer, of course, prizes this. But the way he sets something like the beautiful apart from something like the sublime is that the sublime is an example of contemplating an object that is, in some sense, threatening to the ego. So think about laying, on a field, looking up at the universe on a starry night. Obviously, it's beautiful in some way, but then you can get really sort of wrapped up in the idea of the infinite or alien life or whatever kind of. And so there's this strange contrast between beauty and feeling like almost like threatened existentially. And that's what he thinks the sublime inheres in. And so, what he says is that you have this moment where you feel enraptured, but also very fearful. And you sort of have to make a choice in that moment. You could either kind of turn away from it and like choose like not to think about it or perceive it, or you could kind of turn away from the fear itself, almost rising above it or separating yourself or your ego from that fear. And he thinks a really interesting thing sort of happens here where when you separate yourself from that fear, you actually realize that you're separating yourself from what you thought of as your ego or your like really core self. And the ego, he has a lot of Buddhist leanings as well. He says is really the source of human suffering. So when you separate yourself from the ego and have this really, out of body almost moment, that is what sublime experience inheres in. Although, again, there's like a hint of terror still in the background. So it's kind of beauty and terror mix, which I think is really applies a lot to Frankenstein, as we'll see a little bit later. So I want to talk about the grotesque next, because this is also something that linguistically you'll hear a lot of people say like, oh, that was like really grotesque, or like, meaning that was just super gross. And grotesque etymologically and sort of historically and aesthetically doesn't really mean that. It comes from something related to Dr. Belling could probably outline this more, something related to like Italian grottos that use certain pieces of art. And so it's one of these other complex emotions, whereas sublime doesn't mean super, super awesome or beautiful. Grotesque really doesn't mean super, super gross, at least in the sense that I want to outline. Wolfgang Kaiser talks about the grotesque object or tale or situation or character in the case of Frankenstein is really talking about a structure. And the structure is what he calls like the estranged world, the world that seems very, very strange to us in a way. But he sets out a really important distinction. He says, something that's grotesque is different from something like a fairy tale, right? A fairy tale is a strange world. But the fairy tale, and when you're watching the fairy tale, you sort of set apart your expectations for the world. You enter this world in which it's not going to surprise you that like a fairy starts flying right in the air like that. You would just go along with it because you've now established that you're in a different world. What the grotesque really is something that inheres or is supposed to inhere in our world, but has some usually very small or relatively small aspects suddenly estranged or uncanny, right? So if you ever look at those like super realistic robots, like AI robots that they're trying to make realistic, you're like, there's something really off there. Like that's not, but it looks kind of like a person. I mean, if you were like really far away, it would look like a person, but there's just one thing that's a little bit off and makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable. And that's really kind of where I want to situate my idea of the grotesque. He says, interestingly, we're so strongly affected by the grotesque because it's our world, which kind of in some way becomes unreliable. Our normal schema are not intact anymore, and we feel that we'd in some sense be unable to live in this changed world. It's too bizarre for us to have to reconstruct our conceptions of things. And the grotesque, importantly, instills fear of life rather than fear of death, which I think makes it different than like the terrible or terror. So in this way, the grotesque can be thought of more akin to like the Kafkaesque, right? The really odd or unusual, but ultimately real, rather than the horrific or sort of like phantasmagorical. And I think we can see this is kind of pertinent to medicine, but this I think is my idea of like a really grotesque painting, right? There's obviously, it's not a completely fantastic world. The proportions are all relatively, right? There's like floorboards on the door, it's fine, on the floor. But obviously there's something like really weird going on here. And it's really hard to place why some of the figures here are like fairly disturbing and some of the other ones look like, they could be just normal people, I don't know. So it's the sense of uncanniness that really makes the grotesque. And I think, again, I'll talk about it a little bit more in my answers, but there's important ways in which we can see the sublime and the grotesque in this way. compared and contrasted in Frankenstein that I think really contribute to the thematic weight of the novel. But okay, yeah.
All right, so thank you all so much for all of that. We're going to go into our Q&A portion, and you all have, there's microphones. There are microphones by you, so if you don't mind switching them around, Mr. Casey, I think you have some slides, so if you want to come up here for those, that's fine, or we have the clicker too if you want to do that. All right, so our first question is, when reading Frankenstein as a thematic allegory for medicine, we can see a kind of marriage of the grotesque and sublime, as was so lovely or very well described to us just now. Oh. On the grotesque side, the desire to push scientific boundaries can lead to disturbing or ethically fraught outcomes. On the sublime side, we can see the pursuit of knowledge and the power of creation or capacity for innovation and discovery. But Frankenstein very much leaves us hanging between the two. So how can we find a way out? And Dr. Belling, we'll start with you if that's okay. Oh, sure.
So the hanging the way that I would go first is to think about the figure that we haven't gone to here, which is Mary Shelley's subtitle, Prometheus.
Is it on?
Oh, yeah, and then there we go. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Yeah, so I think what this makes me think of is and I mean, I know David is focusing much more on the grotesque and the sublime, and I can sort of very briefly just the one piece that I would want to add that doesn't come through in the novel, but begins to come through in the films, is that the grotesque, as well as being horrifying, is very often funny. And I think that came across in that image. And I think that's one of the other pieces worth thinking about, is the absurdity and how the novel doesn't really do that. But as soon as you make the story visual, there's that other part that the sublime is very serious, and the grotesque has a potential to be funny. It breaks the rules in a different kind of way. So I think that might be worth thinking about. But in terms of what I wanted to think about in terms of the novel, is how important the figure of Prometheus is, and that ambiguity and ambivalence. When you think of Mary Shelley writing in the Romantic period, and I think in many ways in response to her husband Percy Bysshe Shelley's rewriting of the Prometheus myth in his Prometheus Unbound, which is based on the original, the Aeschylus, and then the original myth of Prometheus, either in some versions creating human beings, which it has obvious connections, or in other versions bringing fire to human beings, which is the source of culture and the source of science and the source of medicine in the Aeschylus version, importantly. But Prometheus's punishment is to be chained up to a rock or staked to a rock by Zeus. And we know the various things about his liver being eaten every day by a vulture or an eagle. So anyway, he gets punished for doing that, for thinking that he can bring something to humans that he doesn't have the right to steal from the gods, and the humans don't have the right to inherit from Prometheus, or to accept. And so the romantic retelling of this, Prometheus unbound from that rock, Prometheus should not be punished because the human should be able to rebel against the gods. The humans should not be punished for their hubris. Human progress is, and rebellion, and this is writing, after the French Revolution, or in this case, I think during, in response to. And so there's that idea of rebellion. And what Mary Shelley does, I think, in writing the modern Prometheus, she's saying, well, yes, we can steal fire from the gods, but then what happens? And in some ways, Frankenstein is a kind of re-questioning that very masculinist, heroic myth about Prometheus, and saying, you might succeed, but you may have unintended consequences. And then one of the questions that becomes interesting is, depending on how you read the novel, you can't quite figure out which one is Zeus and which one is Prometheus. So Frankenstein steals the ability to bring the creature to life and is punished by the creature turning out to be a monster that kills everyone he loves. But at the same time, the monster, and through the novel, is very clearly that it's associated with fire in all kinds of ways. I mean, we know from the film the idea of him being brought to life by lightning, by all the connections with fire and life. And then, of course, he's always burning things, and at the end of the novel, escapes from the novel carrying fire, promising that he's going to burn himself to death. But of course, he gets away from the novel. We can never know for sure whether he did that, or maybe he's still living up in the northern polar. I mean, who knows, right? And that's one of the sort of, I think, brilliant things that Mary Shelley does, is that the creature escapes from the control. So he's almost like a second Prometheus, but he is not the standard romantic hero. He is a very different figure, and he is the one who's been put together in this difficult way from, and I would argue, Mary Shelley's own experience as a 17-year-old who's already had 2 babies and been rejected by her father, and has a very complex story about making new life. And so I think that, I'm not sure if that answers the question at all, but I think that ambiguity and ambivalence about where the ethical position is and who we should fear for and who has the right to show hubris, to be ambitious. And I think the novel in many ways is about our ambivalence, about our ability to achieve extraordinary things and our absolute terror that we will be punished for achieving them. And I think that so the sense of the sublime and then the sense of monstrosity are connected.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful.
I'll just say one quick sentence to take up the very end of that, and that pulls from yours in terms of thinking about it in a very pragmatic, day-to-day clinical reality way. I don't want us to, I want us to stay suspended, hanging. I don't want us to find a way out. Actually, I think clinically, in a very day-to-day experienced way, keeping an eye on that ambivalence is ethically crucial and important. It's not always comfortable, but I don't want to find a way out of it. I think it's necessary. And I think that's why Frankenstein keeps showing up in the clinic in the ways that I tried to describe.
And I know last.
Let me know. Do you want the
No, it's okay. Yeah. Sorry,
That's okay.
have notes, so I'm like awkwardly leaving the group to come up here and answer. Yeah, so yeah, when I read this novel, I find it really hard not to notice just like how constantly Dr. Frankenstein keeps falling, between the sublime and the grotesque, right? He constantly vacillates between the two, and I think it's interestingly kind of instructive for medicine. So here's just a passage, and I'm not going to read it all, but so when Frankenstein, and I know it's probably been a while since a lot of people have read the novel, but at various points he's kind of traveling through the Swiss countryside and through nature, and kind of really feeling in awe of everything around him and the castles, and feels this sense of the sublime, and it even says sublime, which interestingly the word also just comes up throughout the novel. She's really kind of on the nose about it, in a good way. But in the very next paragraph, and this happens 30, 40 times throughout the book, he goes from this all the way to utter despair and horror, and in my conception, this feeling of like the grotesque, that something is wrong with the world, right? He's put this unnatural thing out into the world. He's never able to sustain this sense of like appreciative, sublime beauty, and I think that's really instructive in an interesting way, right? So the question is, why does he seem to do this so often? Well, I think Shelley is trying to tell us something about the disconnect between science, and especially like Victorian or Romantic science, as the era that she was a part of, and the way we do and work and live as scientists, and our capacity for feeling really deeply human emotions, like the sublime, in a sustained way. I think she thinks there's a really fundamental disconnect there, but there doesn't have to be. So we can recall it in Schopenhauer's analysis, right? Again, in order to feel the sublime, there has to be sort of a threat and a threat that you sort of separate yourself from, that you turn away from the fear and you choose willingly to sort of ignore the fear and stare down the object in contemplation. And, I think if we apply Schopenhauer's notion here to the novel, we see that Dr. Frankenstein is really, really highly driven by his quest for both, natural beauty and scientific knowledge, by the feelings of like sublime, the sublime that accompany scientific pursuits and the realization of those scientific pursuits. And I think that while he's very, very highly attuned to experiencing the sublime in nature and science and his work, these experiences for him always have to be kind of fleeting. They're never really sustained. And obviously, in some sense, that's because he feels horror at creating his monster. But in a more sort of deep, personal sense, for a person like Dr. Frankenstein, right, he has these feelings of the sublime that he tries to hold on to are almost immediately like intruded in upon by his ego and his self-conception, as Dr. Belling talked about, this sort of quote great man of science. He ultimately can't separate himself from these sort of grandiose illusions, which have caused him to just lose himself in his work in creating his monster, and thereby he sort of loses his humanity. I think a lot is often said about the place of non-human, even like inorganic nature and its sublimity in Frankenstein. But I think one of the things that goes easily overlooked is Shelley's sort of equal emphasis on human nature and the sublime in human interaction and human feeling. And I think one could argue that Dr. Frankenstein's emotional turmoil really lies in his failure to recognize and respond to the human sublime, and to realize that it's tantamount to the natural and scientific sublime that he's chasing after. So if we apply this notion to medicine, I think it's interesting to consider that much of the emotional valence of medicine, sorry, I lost my place. Much of the emotional valence of medicine comes about in like our feeling for fellow pain or suffering, but the feeling of the sublime can also be there pretty often, if we're willing to let it. And it can be there within these little human moments, I think, embedded in everyday medical practice, even like as sort of grotesque as they can sometimes be, right? For example, the heroics and resilience of dying patients, or in like a secret furtive glance between spouses at the bedside, or genuine laughter breaking through pain. These things are also sublime because perhaps even more so than really great natural forces or objects, they can occasion feelings of deep vulnerability in us as clinicians. And, those feelings of vulnerability might bring about this sense of threat to us. They might be seen as destructive to our self-conceptions as like objective observers or unassailable clinicians. So, if we take Schopenhauer's advice, I think this could be seen as kind of a partial way out, although I also agree with the conception that we don't necessarily need a way out from ambiguity in a lot of senses. A way out of this conflict, at least, between not wanting to feel vulnerable and allowing ourselves to feel sublime and sort of the horror sometimes of everyday medicine, is to let ourselves be vulnerable, right? To let ourselves not do what Frankenstein does and really recognize the human sublime that inheres within medicine. That way we can sort of stand apart from this fear of being vulnerable and find ourselves in a more tranquil, sublime state of mind, which I think is the best mental state in which to practice science and medicine as human beings. So yeah, sorry, that was maybe a little long, but that's yeah.
Thank you. All right, so now we just have, each of our panelists are going to be the only answerer to the next few questions. We do have about 11 minutes, so these might need to get a little bit condensed, but it's been so interesting to hear you all talk and be in conversation with each other. So this question is for Dr. Belling. Why can we draw so many parallels between science fiction and bioethics issues? Are we just imagining these parallels, or do you think one domain is getting inspiration from the other? And if so, which one?
Both ways. But yeah, to do it really quickly, I think when you think about ethical decision making, particularly in the context of, say, biomedical technology, which is really what Frankenstein is about, the way we think about what should or should not be do, the way we develop our ethics is very often consequentialist, right? We imagine what will follow from this intervention. Will it be good? Will it be bad? And the way you can figure out what will happen is only by imagining future consequences, because by definition, if you haven't done the experiment yet, you don't know what's going to happen. You have to hypothesize. And in many ways, those potential future outcomes are fiction, right? They are speculative fictions. You have to imagine possible outcomes and then figure out, calculate which are more or less probable, which ones are that make the risk worth, what potential benefits make it worth the risk of a bad outcome. And so that, I mean, I sort of often get the question, well, why is science fiction always negative? It's always dystopian. It's always about the bad stuff that happens. And I think part of that is our intense anxiety about, the cautionary tale, the thing that says, from when you're a very little child, from fairy tales and things, when you do this brave thing and go into the woods in the dark, this bad thing could happen. And there's something very powerful about how those stories work, rather than, oh, everything will be fine, which isn't anything like as good a story. But I think also that's about our sense of the potential, to come back to Frankenstein and to Prometheus, of the potential for being brave and being punished for being brave. And I think that's why science fiction really, in many ways, or I would say specifically speculative fiction in relation to things like scientific experimentation or developments, is very much walking along that line of consequentialist ethics.
Thank you. I also will say, as a fan of the cozy sci-fi genre, I'm seeing more that are less alarmist, which is very exciting. All right. So question 3 is for Dr. Crowley-Matoka. So what is the difference between self versus non-self transplantation, or human versus non-human or machine transplantation? To you, which one is more interesting from a bioethics perspective, and why?
They are all interesting in different ways, and all sort of hold a lot of promise and a lot of complication and reasons for concern. So the sort of central problem in transplant is that we don't have enough human organs to go around. We never have. It doesn't look like anytime soon we will. And so there are kind of 2 main lines of experimentation with how we might get away from using human organs, both as a way to not have to use the bodies of other people as a source of healing material, kind of ethically, but also just pragmatically, because we don't ever have enough. And one of those lines pursues animals as sources of organs, xenotransplantation, and the other pursues kind of biomechanical solutions. And both of them turn out to be ethically complex in all kinds of ways. There's actually, the anthropologist Leslie Sharp has done a bunch of beautiful ethnography with the scientists sort of working in both of those realms and the kinds of questions they come up against. And in all 3 cases, of whether you're using human organs from animals, or machine organs, questions of sort of, do we really want something that is the most human, the most natural? Does that feel most morally correct? Is that most morally problematic? What feels like an ethical source of organs might also feel like the most disquieting kind of organ to incorporate into the self. So just as a quick example, in the xenotransplant realm, there were sort of lines that pursued like maybe primate sources of organs because they're genetically closest to us would be best. And then people got very uncomfortable with, they feel too close. They don't feel animal enough to be distant to make it feel like a totally ethical, we don't need to worry about it source of organs. So there we wanted some distance. And it turns out that actually have been some great strides made, you may have seen in the news, with using pigs as a source of human organs. I was actually just at the American Society of Bioethics meeting a month or so ago, and listened to a really interesting conversation where people were talking about, this seems like, oh, this will be great. We can just grow organs that'll be ethically clean and delightful. And there was a veterinarian in the audience who stood up and said, I want you to understand how pigs who are being used in this way have to be raised. Pigs are deeply intelligent and profoundly social animals, and to be safe for use as a source of organs, they have to be raised in complete isolation from the second they exit the birth canal. They are in this completely pristine, isolated environment. Do we want to think about the ethics of that? Is that totally okay? And just very quickly on this anthropologist who's done ethnographic work with people working on machine versions, that also seems like, oh, that's clean and easy. We don't have to worry about that. One of the completely fascinating examples that I've never forgotten that she writes about is that the engineers who are working on a mechanical heart, and they had a very engineering mentality. So they just wanted to like perfect it, make it the most smoothly operating, efficient machine possible. And so they developed a pulseless heart because that was engineering wise the most efficient one. And it completely freaked out patients and clinicians because it felt deeply inhuman to not have a pulse, to not have a heartbeat. So it's a different set of ethical questions, but all three of them engage questions of, do we want more human, less human? What's our relationship to the natural or the unnatural? What are the implications for sort of the ethics of where we get organs from and the ethics of what they might do to our identities when we incorporate these things?
Fascinating. All right. So our last question is for Mr. Casey. So using electricity in medicine, so galvanism, was an 18th century idea, which promised much and delivered on some of those promises. These promises affected our literature and culture. Today, AI is the technology that makes lots of promises. Are we seeing a similar trend of AI influencing contemporary literature and culture? Do you see any differences?
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the connections we can draw between, oh, is there feedback here? Between sci-fi stories like Frankenstein and the galvanism and the electricity used in that story, and as it was in real life, and the connection between AI and as it's thought of and conceived now. So, one of the interesting similarities between the idea of galvanism and the current idea of AI, right, is that while Shelley's conception of what galvanism would and could do was partially based in real things people were doing, it didn't turn out to be totally right, right? We can't like totally reanimate a body just by infusing it with electricity. And so I think, that it's a little bit instructive if we, again, draw a parallel between the science fiction of then, that was real, science that people were thinking about. And I think now we often think like AI is going to fulfill all these like prophecies that we see in sci-fi and destroy the world and take over humanity. But we have to understand that predictions and artistic descriptions of scientific concepts are just genuinely usually incomplete and don't turn out to be totally right. Although parts of galvanism are still used, right? We still can use DBS to stimulate parts of the brain and the heart. One other sort of interesting similarity is that I think in modern depictions of AI, as well as this depiction of Shelley's and Frankenstein, is that the piece of technology in Shelley's book being the monster and AI depictions is always like it always wants to be human, but it's always alienated in some way, right? You feel bad for the monster most of the time in the novel because it deeply wants to be human. It's so close to being human, and you see that in like Ex Machina and other many other modern sci-fi films that incorporate AI. And so there's this really interesting through line that exists there. One of the fundamental differences, though, and this is just a quick last point. That I think is quite interesting is that Shelley specifically both talks about the threats of this new science to humanity at large and the threats to the scientist, right? The individual scientist. So she talks about most of the time the real psychic threats to Dr. Frankenstein. But she does talk about the monster wreaking havoc on the earth and possibly destroying humanity. But I think most modern like AI and sci-fi films don't really focus on the individual threat, the individual psychological threat to the creator. I think one good exception is like Oppenheimer, right, where you're talking about the possible destruction of humanity, but also the destruction for of the morality or what have you of the scientist. So I think we need to bring back some element of that, some element of this isn't only the damage that can be wrought to society by being sort of monomaniacal about being the next great whatever inventor. But also this is the damage that you can do to yourself. And I think Shelley does a really good job of doing that.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank all three of you so much. It has been delightful to listen to you all in conversation. Can we do a round of applause for our panelists? Thank you, everyone. Just a couple of notes. Thank you also to our audience for attending, both online and in person. There will be a recording available. And there will also be a survey going out if you registered via email. So please take the time. It's very quick. That helps us with future events. So we'd really appreciate that. All right. Thank you all so much.